And so what we do here every month is we do a different thing with history and George Washington. George Washington becomes a part of the different things we do. And last month we had an author come talk about George Washington's reading. And I think next month is going to be a much more just pure history thing. But today what we're going to talk about is mindset and George Washington. And what I'm really going to do is split this into 3 different things that each give you the same answers. And one of them is the Bhagavad Gita that I've been reading, the ancient Indian text. The other is George Washington. And then the other thing is modern neuroscientific things that we're learning just like now. I mean, we have learned things in the last 20 years that we didn't know about how the brain works. And the fascinating thing is you can take any of those texts, and I'm sure a lot of others, and you get some of the same exact answers. And so these things, both going back and going in the future, help explain George Washington and what he did and how he changed. One of the things I love about George Washington is he changed. I love people who make tremendous changes. I love musicians who change their styles. And George Washington was perhaps one of the worst commanders ever when he commanded during the 7 Years' War. And he became possibly the greatest one ever. So that's a fascinating story. Because if you can go from worst to best, then that's pretty amazing. And it's what I love about George Washington is each of us can learn from how he did it, and we can do this in our own lives. So he's kind of a life coach that you can look at. Somebody 2 days ago I was talking to them about helping him, and they asked if I was a life coach, and I thought, it's bad enough being called a lawyer, you know. Problem with life coaches is there's no body that looks at what they do. So they can sit in a room with you and say, the problem you have making money is you're attached. I think what would help you make money is to give me $2,000. And they do this. And if you're a psychiatrist, you go to jail if you say this. If you're a life coach, you're just saying what every other life coach says. So, but George Washington, what I love, and like I say, we're going to go through these 3 ways, but George Washington's life is a real lesson because he's a real person. And so he does some of these things and he makes these changes. So we're going to talk about how you can use your brain rather than let your brain use you, and how you can make tremendous change. You know, Buddha says one person may conquer in battle 1,000 times 1,000 others, but the true heroes are those who conquer themselves. And this is what the Bhagavad Gita is all about. If you read this book, it starts with the character talking to God, saying, why do I have to slaughter these people? And you think it's this kind of odd thing about war. And what Gandhi and other people say is, no, that's not what it's about. It's about the internal structure of somebody's brain and killing off those parts of their brain that are unuseful to us. Because, you know, we've all heard what St. Augustine said, right? God, make me good, but not today. It's hard to change, especially if we have a story wrapped around what we do and who we are, because then the ego kicks in and it becomes protective of that story. But you find out when you study people, and you find out when you study George Washington, the most difficult war he ever had was this war inside himself, was this war he had to do to conquer some of his tendencies that were not so good. You know, you can watch, if you watch the Rocky movies, there's a scene where Rocky is teaching Creed and he points at the mirror and he says, this guy's the toughest guy you're ever gonna face. And so it's true, right? If you know, leadership is first conquering your own brain and then taking control of your own life, and then you can move on to lead other people. But that almost becomes the easy part. And then it has to be combined with action. I have one seminar that's all about Gettysburg, and it's called Leadership Acts Large and Small. And one of the things we talk about is that there's 5 stages of leadership, and the least important is having a position of importance. And when you're younger, you think that's the most important, right? I'm the manager. You have to do what I say. And sometimes that's true, and sometimes that isn't true. And you find out that managers and the person in the authority doesn't always have anything to say. And one way I learned this was when I was in the 1980s, I used to be a temporary secretary. And the fascinating thing about being a temporary secretary was, like, every business you go to seems like the one you just left. Everything's the same. But what would be interesting, there was always some harried guy who had a high-level position, who had who everybody knew as the secretary from hell. And the secretary would yell at him every day, and she'd been there for 100 years, as long as the business had been there. So this guy had a high position, but obviously you knew, even as the temporary secretary, he has no power, because he ended up with the secretary from hell. So position, but then are you able to use that position? Are you able to convince people to do things either for their good or whatever? Let's talk about what modern science has taught us about this inner struggle. First of all, for years and years and years, we have had the same belief about how the brain works. And that belief has been, and I'll tell you why I think we came to this conclusion, but that belief has been that after 5 years, you have these synaptic connections and they attach. And if you look it up at Google, this still tells you, yeah, you know, you have 5 years, the synaptic connections attach, and then your brain becomes hardened into this. And so once you've gone through these 5 years, it's going to be hard to make physical changes in your brain. And what we've learned is that you can make physical changes in the brain, and the physical changes obviously make changes outside of that. We started to learn about this back in the 1800s, when somebody had this. There was somebody who had some kind of disease. Nobody knew what it was, but he could only utter one word. And so after he died, they did an autopsy of him to find out, well, where is the center of his brain that connected to his ability to verbalize? And sure enough, there was a lesion in the upper cortex, and they said, okay, this is the part where that happens. And so people started looking at this as if that was a fixed thing. Now, that's going to happen in 1861. And that's going to create these things that we called brain maps, where we had these brain maps of the brain that showed you the different kinds of connections that were on there. Now, there are a few people who didn't believe that this was all hardened. William James was one. He said that organic matter, especially nervous tissue, seems endowed with plasticity. Of course, who's going to listen to William James about that? The scientists are all agreeing. They're all saying that the brain stays the same. Now, starting around 1921, scientists start looking into whether or not these brain maps could possibly change. Now, the first thing they discovered was that the brain maps were often different with different people. So that seemed a little surprising to them. And then some people started doing these tests to show that you could actually induce change in the physical makeup of the brain. So, in other words, on animals, if you took away the ability to use 2 of your fingers and you started, and the animal started to use the other finger, a monkey, that would make a change in the actual brain map. And a lot of people didn't believe this. People were still winning awards saying the opposite. But there were these people who were putting this out there. And they found that the physical structure of the brain changed through time. And they found that you could actually induce the change. Now, first, you can induce the change by making different physical activities. But the second thing they figured out is you can actually create a physical change in the brain just by use of the brain, just by the type of things you think about. So this, of course, goes back. We've got the Bhagavad Gita, and we've got neuroscience, and we have Rocky, and Rocky IV. If you can change, and I can change, everyone can change. So if you can change the makeup of your brain, you can actually make a huge change in your life. Now, how do we use this knowledge? How do we use this information? How do we use this information to put ourselves into a state of belief? As I've told people, and you're probably tired of hearing it, but I'll say it again quickly this time. There's two states of being. There's a state of faith, and there's a state of unbelief. And there is no neutral ground. And so for those people who think they're going into something as a quote, agnostic, the brain thinks is unbelief. Because to be an agnostic means, well, I believe if it's proven to me. And that's true of everything, of course, right? If you convince me rabbits are smarter than people, I will believe this. So people go into things thinking that they have a state of belief, and it's really a state of unbelief because it's agnostic. And one of the last talks we're going to have is going to be about Washington crossing the Delaware. And what I learned from that was that you can just choose to have faith in something as a logical position. Because if you choose to have faith in something working, then it is far more likely that it's going to work out. And you know, when I was a PD, I would have people who quit their job to be a private lawyer, and they'd be back in 6 months. So, you know, they gave up. And so what I knew is, well, they never really believed they could do it, because nothing is going to be that easy. Everything is longer than you expect it to be. But if they came back, it meant that, well, we want something to break our way to show we made the right decision. That's what a lot of people do. They want something to show them that they've made the right choice. And it doesn't always happen very fast. A lot of times, nothing does show them that they have the right choice. And then that causes them the excuse to go back. Now, what puts us into a state of unbelief in our brains? And the answer to that is limiting beliefs. Now, before we even talk about how you get rid of these limiting beliefs, and this is the exciting thing about what we're learning about the brain, is you can literally change. I mean, you know, it's such a volatile thing, the brain. It changes so much. And I used to know that as a lawyer because I would have these mistaken ID cases, and I really studied it. And I learned that if I say that I saw you rob a supermarket, you look a little shifty, it's possible. I'm really just giving my opinion, because this is what the evidence all showed. You know how if you see the TV shows and they show 7 pictures of somebody, is it one of these 7 guys, right? Now Barney Miller, they had a book. You remember Barney Miller? And they'd look through the book. Now that's the way you should do it. Of course Barney Miller does it right. But other people would show 7 pictures. And you, sir, just have the misfortune of looking more like that guy than the other 6 people. But this is the thing that was so difficult as a defense attorney. The witness would see the picture of you and be positive it was you. And if they showed the witness the picture of the real person, they no longer saw that person because it had been erased. And they now saw because they went through their brain and they saw it. And we had cases where, there was one horrible case where this woman was raped. She saw the guy for an hour. They did this, 7 pictures. She picked the guy. And he went to prison for years and years until DNA evidence proved he didn't do it. And they showed her who did do it, and she said, no, it's not him. Now, she wasn't trying to lie, but that's what the brain does. And that's scary if you get picked up by the police, but it's also very hopeful that we can make such substantial changes. Now, when we're first born, we're a baby. You learn something new every day from me, don't you? You're first born, you're a baby, and everyone loves everything you do. You poop, and it's adorable. And you get nothing but love and acceptance from everything you do for a few years there. Your mother is chemically required to love everything you do. And then we hit this weird period where suddenly you have to do things to get acceptance. And that was never there before. You just had acceptance, and that was great. And then one day, no, this isn't cute anymore, and that's not cute anymore. And then this is this period where we start creating these synaptic connections. At first, we have like 25 billion synaptic connections. And that's like when we used to get those computers back in the day, and all they did was basically turn on, and you had to put the hard drives in, and really all they knew how to do was the very basic stuff, and then you'd put in the programs. Well, that's what we're born with. We're able to breathe. Our heart beats. Tear ducts work. We can eat. And then we start getting these synaptic connections. We start putting things together. And in the first 5 years, we have like a quadrillion synaptic connections are made, which all I know is that's even more than our national debt. So it has to be a lot of money. It has to be a lot. And we're learning all these things. And our brain is accepting all these things. Now, our brain wants to have concrete evidence of things, concrete knowledge about things. And so the most clear description of how this works is you're 5 years old and a dog bites you. And so when you're 10 years old, when you're 15 years old, you see a dog. Now your brain goes into its hard drive, and your brain goes back to this thing is dangerous because this thing bit you, and you are scared of dogs. And so you don't want a dog, you don't want to date anybody who wants a dog, you don't want to have anything to do with dogs, all because of something that happened when you were a little child. Well, how do you erase that? Well, I'm sure you can all guess. I mean, one way is to think your way out of it, but the most obvious way is to get a dog that doesn't act in a belligerent way, that isn't dangerous. You get to know that dog. And just like the person erased their image of the individual they saw, you can change the synaptic connection. And if there's a neuroscientist who knows what they're looking at, they could find a difference about what your brain did before and what your brain does now. And you can rid yourself of this fear of dogs. So, the first thing is it's easy to figure out that you're scared of dogs. Now, most of us have connections that are caught up in much more subtle things. Maybe you're scared of intimacy. Maybe money terrifies you. It's a lot of different things. So sometimes you have to figure out what those things are. But the exciting thing is, whatever it is, you can change. There's people who feel that they should only make so much money. Well, that's because that's what they believe in their brain, and their brain is going to go back and their brain is going to figure out why that is. And so you have to change that connection from the brain. I mean, the brain does all this stuff for us, but we misunderstand it to think the brain is us. The brain gives us some ideas, the brain gives us some thoughts, but the thought is not us. There's something else, there's a soul, there's something else, and the brain is a tool just like our other tools. And that's why one of the things we talk about in terms of leadership is you can't decide the how before you decide the what. Because if you say, well, I want to make $40,000, how? What your brain does, it's because it's what our brains do, is it comes up with every reason you cannot make $40,000. And it lists them for you. And it's convincing you, don't do this scary thing that this brain doesn't know about. This brain's never been there. So what George Washington did when he crossed the Delaware, he just said, this is going to work. You know, it's my favorite scene in The Martian, where this guy's stuck on Mars, and he's alone. The astronauts have left him. And there's this scene where he says, I am not going to die on this planet. Now, if he had said, how am I going to get off this planet? What would his brain have told him? Are you joking? You're not getting off this planet. Your astronauts left you. They don't know you're here. There's no food. But he didn't. What he did was the same thing George Washington did. He said, I'm not going to die on this planet. And then the brain will, if you give it that supposition, the brain figures out how to meet that, what you're telling it. Okay, well, you have potatoes. Maybe you can grow potatoes. You know, you can create your own fertilizer. It starts to think about it. If you reverse the process that most of us do, which is say how before the what. Let's talk about George Washington a little bit and some of the, and what I'm going to do is go through an exercise with George Washington with some of the things he might have said. Because when I do this in the seminars, and I hope some people, I think we're going to do a 3-day seminar in October, and I hope some people do this, and we do exercises with this. But let's say it's George Washington. Now, in our, I think, first time we talked about here, we talked about what George Washington's what his mission was, what he wanted to have. And what he wanted was to be a gentleman. What he wanted was to be the man. He wanted to be an important character. And we know that because we know what he read, we know what he wrote in his journals. Now, he's not a, you always have to be somewhat of a detective, as we saw last month. Because you have some people who write in their journals all their thoughts, like John Adams. John Adams writes just the greatest journals in the world because he's just like bleeding onto his page, you know, everything he's thinking, and he's complaining about people, and he's insulting people. And so they're the most fun journals you'll ever read. You know, there's this one part with John Adams when he's a young man, and he says, you know, I'm always chasing after women. I'm a lawyer, I can't afford to get married, I am renouncing female society, I'm going to get up at 5:30 in the morning, I'm going to read the Bible, and I'm going to work, and I'm going to be a lawyer. And then the next day he's invited to a party. And so he wants to go to the party, but he just yesterday renounced all female society. So then he goes back to his journal and he says, would it not be a form of arrogance to renounce 1/2 the human population? Isn't there a great deal I can learn from women? They know about philosophy. They know things from a whole, and he wrote all the reasons. He says, you know what, I have to go to the party. I really do. So, but George Washington isn't quite like that. But what do we see? Well, first of all, what does it mean that he wants to be the man? Let's say that in short order. Well, what does that mean? Well, he wants to be a gentleman, which means you have money, you have the correct disposition of a gentleman, and you have the character, the education of a gentleman. Well, what are his limiting beliefs going to say? Well, my dad died when I was 11. I'm the child of a second wife. I'm not inheriting anything. My stepbrother's got that education. I don't have an education. I'm stuck with my mother, who's not letting me go anywhere. And I lose my temper a lot. I don't have the disposition of a gentleman. So what does he have to do? Well, he has to convince himself that he is a gentleman. That's what he has to do. And so one thing he does as a younger man, he writes down all the rules of what it means to be a gentleman. You probably all heard about that, the rules of civility. You know, he's writing these things out, he's reading these things, and he's viewing those people who are gentlemen that he can. Take what you can gather from coincidence. He's going to view the Fairfaxes, who are family nearby, and he's going to learn so much from them about what it is to be a gentleman, how you can be a gentleman. And, you know, from Lord Fairfax, he's going to learn, well, this guy's a gentleman, but he's also kind of a ruffian. You know, he's a tough guy. He goes out. He lives in a tent with Native Americans, and he doesn't change his clothes for 5 days. That's the kind of gentleman I want to be, you know. He has to believe that he can achieve money. So what he does is he becomes a surveyor. And he's looking at being a soldier. You know, he looks at what his brother did. He has to try to change his temper. And so he's going to read the Romans and the Stoics. He loves Cincinnatus. Now this, to me, every time I look at this, I can't help but think that it's more than just good fortune, that by some coincidence, the person who becomes the general of the army for the American Revolution, his hero is a guy who got ultimate power, gave it back, and went off to be a farmer. And if you just look at every moment of our history, that is the moment of our greatest lucky bounce, if you want to call it that. Coincidence, as I say, take what you can gather from coincidence. Einstein says coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. I mean, here we have the one guy in the world, maybe, who's not going to refuse to follow, of all people, John Adams. John Adams is the head of the War Committee. What does he know about war? Has he ever smelled gunpowder? Can you imagine if it was Horatio Gates with that job, or John Hancock with that job? So just an amazing piece of luck that that's the individual. But George Washington, when he starts off, when he becomes a colonel in the what most people call the French-Indian War, the 7 Years' War, he's a very different person, very different, as different as you can get from the person we know, from the person we see there. And so I'm going to talk about some of those differences, and I'm going to go through the four things that the Gita says that you have to master, and it's anger, fear, willpower, and self-centeredness. And I'm going to go through George Washington with these things. Anger. Colonel Fairfax writes to George's mother, and he writes, "I wish I could say that he governs his temper. He is subject to attacks of anger on provocation, sometimes without just cause." This is somebody who is very passionate and gets very angry. Now, what Fairfax used to boast about is he said he trained himself to make no outward show of emotion, and I think George Washington learned about that. George Washington, at the end of his presidency, a woman says once, "You know, I can see how happy you are to be leaving the office." And George Washington's response was, "You are wrong. My countenance never yet betrayed my feelings." The most amazing thing about George Washington is how he governed this anger, which isn't to say he didn't get angry and yell. He did. But he did it in situations where it never harmed him. or harmed others for that matter, except people like Alexander Hamilton who had to listen to him yell. But when he gets into really tough states, he doesn't let his anger control. And if you look at history, many people, that becomes their downfall. Now, I love Valley Forge because I just don't know another place as large and as prestigious as this that is dedicated to this internal struggle. That's what this place is, right? There was not a battle here. This was about making the army. This was about getting ready for the army. And when George Washington is here, he is in huge difficulty politically because he's lost a couple battles. And, you know, I'm already hearing Joe must go about the Phillies, right? That's how it is. You lose a couple battles. And George Washington comes here and his state is very precarious. And people who perhaps know how he acted back in the day are going to try to get him to quit. Now, when he was in the French-Indian War, 7 Years' War, he would have so many arguments with Governor Dinwiddie that Governor Dinwiddie reached the point where he just couldn't stand writing to him anymore. He threatened to quit, I think, 6 times during that war. Well, the George Washington that's here at Valley Forge, they're going to try to get him angry so that he will offer to resign or resign. And what you have is something called the Conway Cabal. That's what writers call it. Maybe that's a little more grandiose than it should be. Maybe it was just some people unhappy with Washington, but there's a group of people who set forth to get him fired. And what's hard for us to understand when we study the Revolutionary period is how precarious it was. You know, we look at that painting of the signing of the Declaration and we see Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and wow, these are the demigods, but try to pretend it's 1776. There's no government. You're probably not getting paid. There is a Congress, whatever that is. And George Washington, I really think of him more as an entrepreneur with a startup. And his startup is the army. Because he has to convince these people it's true. Now, no general back in that day cared a great deal what the heck their soldiers were thinking. Right? They're cannon fodder, as Shakespeare used to write. Well, Washington understands he has to make them, he has to sell them on this thing. Because this is not like any other army there's ever been, because there's no government. There is a Congress, but they can't draft people, they can't tax. It's all on Washington. It's all on him. I think he has a harder job than any other general has ever had. Because if you're looking at someone like Eisenhower, say, well, when there's shoes that are gone, he doesn't have to go find shoes. He doesn't have to convince the Allies not to go home. And George Washington has to do all of that. You know, when those tents are out there before the huts are even made and he's walking along or he's riding his horse out here, he's hearing cuckoo, cuckoo, which is the soldiers saying, we're going to fly the coop. You feed us or we're just leaving. And so this is constantly a possibility. So George Washington comes out here, and so the reason I was saying that was like someone like Horatio Gates, if he wins a big battle at Saratoga, he just doesn't tell Washington, which is an incredible breach to not tell your commanding general. But he decides, I'm the commanding general. What's the Congress? John Adams? I don't have to do that. Washington gets a lot of these kind of insults. I mean, more than I have the time to tell you. Dr. Benjamin Rush, who we're going to talk about one of these weeks, who's a guy I'm very interested in. For some, you know, Dr. Rush has this big problem is he talks too much. And I know that because John Adams said he talked too much. So if John Adams says you talk too much, you talk way, way too much. So for some reason, he decides to write a letter to Patrick Henry, who he doesn't know that well, ripping Washington. Part of it's he's upset with Washington about some medical things that he doesn't think Washington's doing, which then it turns out he did do. But it's just somebody who talks too much. But anyway, Patrick Henry gets this anonymous letter. He doesn't know who it's from. And he goes up to George Washington. He says, look at this letter someone sent me. And Washington says, oh, that's Dr. Benjamin Rush. I know him. I'm having dinner with him tonight. Does he bring it up? No. Does he show any anger? No. You know, there's this great quote in the Bhagavad Gita, which I really love because it talks about a broken bell. So we love broken bells in Philadelphia, right? It says you got to be like a broken bell, that you don't respond. You don't ring when it's knocked. You hold it in. And you don't react. You're in control. You don't have to get angry because someone's angry at you. Boy, these are hard things to learn, right? When I first quit being a lawyer, I was an Uber driver for a while in order to survive. My wife said, this is such a great career move, David. It's wonderful. But the amazing thing was people would honk at me, and it didn't upset me at all anymore because I was working. Like if it had been 3 months ago and someone was honking, I would react, I would get angry, but now I was taking it from a different thing. And so you learn, wow, I don't have to react. George Washington is not going to react. He's going to hold his cards. Well, the anti-Washington faction decides we're really going to get him. We're going to send Conway out, who Washington sees as really his, in a lot of ways, biggest enemy, although I wouldn't elevate him to that extent. Washington doesn't see him as a large force, but he sees him as someone who's working with Gates. There's a famous letter he wrote criticizing George Washington. I can't go through all the facts of that, but I'll be happy to talk about it. But Washington knows he's criticizing him. So the Congress, the part of the Congress that's opposed to George Washington, they say, you know what? We're going to put him in a job equal to George Washington and send him out to Valley Forge. And George Washington's going to get so angry, he's going to resign. Because we're sending his biggest enemy to walk in and tell him that he's an equal with him. And so he shows up, Conway does, and George Washington, he goes into the office, and George Washington says, yes. And Conway says, well, you know, Congress has given me this job. And I need to look at all your papers and really judge how you're doing, you know. And George Washington says, okay, show me the official document that appointed you to this. He says, well, I came straight. I didn't wait to get the official document. So he says, goodbye. When you have the official document, show it to me. And Conway stomps out and he writes all these angry letters. But think of the brilliance of that. He's not opposing Congress. Matter of fact, he's saying Congress matters. He's not tricked into doing something out of anger to be disloyal to Congress. He attaches himself to Congress and he sends them out. And what Washington does is he basically lets these people hang themselves. You know, he lets Conway make mistakes. He stays quiet. He invites people out to Valley Forge from the Congress. And when they come out, they see that, wow, you know, he's doing a pretty good job out here. And so he just, by just not reacting, by being the bell that doesn't ring, by suppressing that natural feeling of anger that any of us would have, he's able to outwit this Conway cabal. And so if you look at his actions in the French Indian War, you see that there's just, nothing the same. Now, the second thing that it talks about is fear. And, Dale Carnegie wrote a book, How to Stop Worrying and Start Living. I mean, fear is the thing that stops us so much. And there's this one moment, when Washington is in that 7 Years' War, he shows fear on a whole lot of levels. And fear can be a natural thing, but fear is often something that just holds us back unnaturally. And we've all heard about the zebra, that once a zebra escapes the lion, 5 minutes later, its heart is back to normal because the zebra's in the moment. And the zebra does not have post-traumatic stress syndrome. The zebra does not need to talk to its analyst about how the lion almost killed him, because the zebra focuses on the moment the zebra is in. It's kind of like this great movie, Mysterious Island. I don't know if you ever saw it. These guys go up on this island, this giant crab comes. This giant crab, and they're like fighting off the cold crab. Oh my gosh. And they push the crab, and it goes into this like volcano. And then they're all hanging out in the next scene, eating crab meat and laughing, And you're like, if there's a giant crab, are you worried maybe there are other giant things on the island? They're not. They're like the zebra. What Dale Carnegie says to do is center on the moment. Don't center on the past. I mean, most of what we're worrying about on the past isn't a useful and helpful thing. Most of the things we worry about in the future. The most famous moment George Washington has, probably in the 7 Years' War, is when he opens fire on people that it's pretty clear he shouldn't have opened fire on, that they were diplomats, and it turns into this slaughter, and these Native Americans are chopping people's heads off, and he writes these letters that he writes 3 letters in one day, and you just can read even today from the verbiage that he's just sitting there terrified that he's destroyed his career. And he's clearly writing these letters out of fear. They're going to tell you they were diplomats, but the absurdity of this is obvious, kind of letters. And then he's going to create Fort Necessity, which is about 40 minutes outside of Pittsburgh. And I love to bring my seminars to Fort Necessity because it's the worst fort ever created, ever in the history of forts, because there's this little circle around all these hills and woods. So it's the exact opposite of what a fort should be. Right? You want to be up high, see far. He went low and put hills around him. And he writes to Governor Dinwiddie, this will be a fine field for an engagement, a charming field for an engagement. He gets surrounded, people are slaughtered, and there's this moment where he has to sign. Well, what happens is the French, he gets a break, basically. The French decide to let him sign a document where he and his men can leave because it's such a bad fort, they think it's a setup. They think nobody builds a fort this bad. There's got to be the British behind or something. Let's have him, So they give him, and he signs this horrible document that basically admits to committing assassination. He tries to blame the translator. And the translator, the word in French was assassination. So he's saying, well, they didn't translate it to me correctly. Well, you might have been able to pick it. So I was talking to Ed Langell about this on my podcast, and he said, well, he's scared. And Edward Langell is a very good military writer. And I thought, really? And we talked about it a little, and then it made sense. I just don't think of George Washington ever being scared. But as a young man, the guy who was leading that army was the brother of the person who had been killed in the earlier battle, Jumonville. So if he's not killed the next day by the battle, he must think he's going to be hung. He must think his career is over, and his life is probably over, and he probably acts out of fear. Now, the thing that's amazing about George Washington as an older man is his seeming lack of fear. And we'll talk about why he's able to do that, really. But there's this one moment in Brandywine where there's this guy named Captain Ferguson on the British. And Captain Ferguson sees George Washington with this other individual. Doesn't know he's George Washington, but thinks this looks like a very important person. George Washington has this very large hat. He's walking with someone who's dressed up very nicely. And he points and he yells at him to stop. And George Washington turns and acknowledges him. And he turns around and he keeps walking. And the guy yells again, "Stop or I'll shoot," and George Washington keeps walking. And the guy just does not shoot him. He says, "I couldn't shoot him." You know, he looked at me, he nodded. I just couldn't shoot this guy in the back. And when I look at that incident, and there's hundreds of incidents of George Washington showing ridiculous bravery, but when I look at that incident, I think, okay, what he did was, he didn't want to be captured. He thought it would be better to be killed than captured. And he knew if he ran, they'd shoot him, so he just looked at him, acknowledged him, turned around and walked, and hoped for the best. I mean, it's kind of an aplomb. It's an amazing thing. And as you read about him, you almost doubt some of these stories, but there's so many of them, of him going beyond his soldiers, of him in the Battle of Princeton, in between the two armies, of him putting himself in this danger all the time. The other thing that it talks about is self-centeredness. And I think that's where we can kind of bring this thing to a conclusion tonight, because the self-centeredness becomes maybe the most important thing that George Washington changes. Now, when he's in the 7 Years' War, he is very self-centered. He is very concerned with himself. He is very concerned with how much money he makes. He is very concerned with whether or not he's in the British rather than the American group of people. He's very concerned about where they're going to build a road that goes out to Pittsburgh. You know, he wants the British to build this road right through Virginia because he's part of the Ohio Company that's going to buy land out there. And boy, that'll save us a lot of work. Well, the British look at it and they realize, well, it makes more sense to do it through Pennsylvania. Washington writes a letter, all is lost by heavens, our enterprise is ruined. And there's a quote by Marcus Cunliffe, who is a British historian. He writes, "There is something unlikable about the George Washington of 1753 to 1758. He seems a trifle raw and strident, too much on his dignity, too ready to complain, too nakedly concerned with promotion." And that is the George Washington of that period. He wants to be a gentleman, but he's not a gentleman. And that makes him thin-skinned, and he's young. You know, when people come to my company and they say, well, I'm a VIP, I always want to say, well, important people really don't tell you they're important, you know. And if you're really a gentleman, you're not going to act like George Washington is acting. But he's not under the rules of the day. And that's what adds to his difficulties. There's nobody who's less self-centered when he becomes the general of the United States Army. You know, and self-centeredness is such a thing that's almost hard for us in this day and age to believe in people who aren't self-centered. You know, the examples that come to mind are when the Americans go to President Zelensky, okay, we're going to get you out of here, and it doesn't even occur to him to leave. I don't need a road out of here. I need ammunition. We hardly recognize it. You know, I was watching the Phillies last week. I forget who hit a homer. And he hits the homer, and they all have a different handshake for each other when they hit a homer. So he's like, okay, they're 10 runs behind. If I was the manager, I would throw something at the guy. They're 10 runs behind, and and it's like, wow, if you practiced fielding as much as you do this handshake, you would be amazing. That's where we are in this day and age. Well, I think the real key to making these kind of substantial changes has to do with self-centeredness. It's certainly what the Bhagavad Gita talks about, being less connected to results. You know, it's funny that, you know, I was reading this, and I'm being very good lately. I don't drink, I don't eat this and that, and I told my wife, I said, you know, you should call me Mahatma. And she's like, what? I'm like, yeah, you should call me Mahatma. I mean, I'm like a prince. I'm just so good now. I don't do anything wrong anymore. So very sarcastically, she sometimes calls me Mahatma, but here's the thing, I like it. You know, at first it was a joke. And then it occurred to me, like, you can call somebody Michael Jordan, that doesn't make him Michael Jordan. I'm never going to be a good basketball player, but anyone here, anyone could be a saint. It just means you love everybody else and everyone around you more than you do yourself. I mean, we love saints because they do the thing we could all do. And those who really do it become famous because it's so unusual, it's so impossible. But what the Gita talks about is going on that road to sainthood, or at least pushing that direction. You know, last night I wanted to hear one type of music, my wife wanted another. I said, okay, we'll listen to yours. I'm thinking, see, I'm a saint. I'm Mahatma, I knew it. Washington transcends so much of his personal desires. He does not visit home for 8 years. That's very unusual back then. Generals go home. Well, again, this is a different kind of army. If he goes home, everyone's going home. When they invite him to Philadelphia and he goes out and he has a meeting, I mean, it's just the opposite of the guy he was. They're like, oh, we're having a dinner tomorrow. He says, no, I got to go back to the army. It happened several times. I need to be with my army. The most amazing is when the British Army goes through Mount Vernon, and Lund Washington, who's the caretaker out there, he tells the British soldiers, all right, we'll let you eat our food, you know, if you don't destroy Washington's mansion. And they say, okay. So they let him eat the food. Washington's horrified when he learns this. He says, I would much rather you had let them destroy the house than fed them the food. Because he's thinking of everyone else who's lost lives, lost their property. Why should he not? He really, in amazing ways, has transcended all that selfishness he had. Which, like Cunliffe said, if you read about that stage, you can't like him very much. And he does it because he's able to look at himself. 18 years pass. I have no doubt that he was smart enough to realize the mistakes he had made as a younger man. I also have this weird feeling that he knew he was going to be needed. I don't think he knew why he knew necessarily, but there's certain people that they seem to prepare themselves for a great event before the event happens. You know, George Washington becomes someone that no one gets real close to, but that everyone admires. There's a story where he's at a dinner party, and Alexander Hamilton is there, and Gouverneur Morris is there, and Hamilton says, have you noticed nobody touches George Washington? Everyone else, they shake hands, they touch. Everyone just bows and runs away from him. Right? Washington would have been fine during COVID. He did not shake hands. because he felt that was a phony familiarity. The one time he shook hands that I know of was when he resigned in Annapolis, Maryland. And he took his glove off and he shook every soldier's hand, and he's crying. So it means something to him. If he shakes your hand, it means something. So anyway, Gouverneur Morris said to Hamilton, I could touch him. I'm his age. So Hamilton said, all right, I'll buy the 6 of us dinner if you go up to Washington, pat him on the back, say, how's it going, old boy? And so he did it after about 6 glasses of wine. And Washington just turned and looked at him and didn't say a word, just looked at him. And so then Gouverneur Morris went back to Hamilton. He said, well, I won the bet, but at great cost. Nothing would induce me to repeat it. Washington became this person that everyone could surround themselves with, and that became something that stood for the whole cause. One writer wrote, before there was a country, before there was even a symbol of that country, there was Washington. Because when he's writing out to Massachusetts, we haven't declared independence, we don't have an army. We don't have a flag, we don't have a national seal. We just have George Washington. And George Washington is going to deal with all of that. George Washington is going to move out of worrying about himself and move out of being self-centered. And the exciting thing is that whatever source that I'm talking about you look at, the ancient text of the Gita or modern neuroscience, you find that that becomes the thing that makes you effective. In business too, you find out that business are the people that put the clients above themselves. And you find the people that become most successful are the ones who put others above themselves. And so we can all get tremendous hope for ourselves, no matter how weak and how much we fail in trying to be Mahatmas. It's doable. And George Washington went from one extreme to the other extreme just by the battle that he was able to have inside his head, which this is a wonderful place to talk about that, because he had to go through that same kind of battle with his army for them to become the army that could win the Revolutionary War. All right, well, thank you very much. I would love to answer any questions anyone might have.